So thanks for joining with our webinar series. Tonight, we're going to be talking about muscle disorders, and largely, we'll talk about some similarities between muscle disorders and their management, but a lot of them are going to share a lot of the same symptomology and even some of the same management principles. So let's get started. And again, if you have questions, feel free to send them to me via Facebook. So muscle disorders, does it really matter which one? So what we're going to do is talk about both non-genetic muscle disorders, so ones that are maybe arising from nutrition or trauma, etc., as well as the range of genetic muscle disorders that we know about, and then really emphasize their management, because that's the key most horse owners are going to be concerned with. So muscle disorders can fall into kind of two broad categories. So one, a horse just may be showing muscle weakness. So in this picture, you can actually see some atrophy over the horse's top line. And that can be caused from neurologic reasons. So essentially, if we damage the innervation to the muscle so that it's not experiencing contractions, you're going to see degeneration of that. And then we can also have atrophy that's occurring at the level of the muscle itself for a variety of reasons. And then we can also have muscle pain. So these can kind of go together. Muscle pain could be a local event. It can even just be something that's related to a trauma. Or we can have these broader systemic events that we talk about, our exertional myopathies. And so they still may be seen in the larger muscle groups, but again, it relates to something happening more systemically in the animal versus a localized muscle group. So what can cause a horse to have a muscle disorder? So we're going to talk about some nutritional causes. Trauma can certainly cause muscle damage and any of the related soreness or weakness. There are some infectious reasons a horse would have muscle disorders, but probably the most common, or maybe the one that horse owners are really concerned about, are a lot of the genetic diseases that may cause horses to have muscle disorders. So let's start with nutritional reasons. So we'll start with maybe some of the things that are the easiest to fix. So certainly if a horse is undernourished or is not receiving enough food or calories, they're going to use their body's muscle stores essentially to keep life supported. So this picture here, you can see this poor mare. She's essentially a body condition score 1, and she's using all of her muscle reserves to provide energy to support that foal. So really remarkable example of how much the female often sacrifices their own body stores to support life of the young. So lack of food, so not enough calories, will result in some muscle weakness and disorders. Some horses may have some malabsorption issues. So if the intestinal tract is not working correctly anymore, we're not absorbing nutrients out of the tract despite their presence in the diet, that could be another reason that we would have a nutritional issue. When we talk about muscle, obviously we think about protein. And so unfortunately, we probably don't know it as much in horses about their specific amino acid requirements as we do in other monogastric species or the production species. But I would say that field is always advancing, and so we're getting a lot better at knowing what those specific requirements are. Very specifically, we often hear vitamin E and selenium. Those two kind of go hand in hand as far as antioxidants and muscle health. But deficiencies of vitamin E can certainly contribute. Normally, horses that are able to graze fresh growing grass or pasture access should have adequate levels of vitamin E. So it's really our harvested forages that may not be sufficient in vitamin E, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. So let's start on the protein side. As I mentioned, we probably don't have as good a handle on amino acid requirements in the horse as we do in other species. And what may be frustrating for horse owners is that we always just talk about protein in terms of the amount of crude protein in the horse's diet. And while the nutritionists may get down in the weeds about site of digestion and absorption and forage versus concentrate sources, most horse owners just, really look at the percent protein. But as we've learned a little bit more, we definitely know there's some key amino acids. Lysine is always the first limiting amino acid, threonine typically the second, and then methionine. So oftentimes when you're looking at feed supplements, or even feeds, you'll see that these three are added or at least mentioned in your feed tag or feed analysis. But there may be some other important ones. Our branched chain amino acids, valine, leucine, and isoleucine, really are pretty key players when it comes to muscle metabolism. And so there's still some work in that area of really defining what actually happens there. We're seeing now in horse nutrition an increasing use of specific protein supplements. Again, I don't advocate for particular brands. These are just as examples of some more concentrated protein sources. So many of the feed companies will produce they're often termed as ration balancers, but a lot of times that's what they are, as a protein supplement, while trying to avoid extra calories in the horse's diet. And we're starting to see some more use of whey protein. Note that this is not going to be a cheap way to provide protein, but it's a more concentrated source of amino acids, so to speak, the key amino acids that are pretty digestible. And so we're hearing more research about those in performance horses especially, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. So vitamin E, so I just wanted to spend a little bit on the nutritional aspect of vitamin E disorders. So some horses may actually be deficient in vitamin E, and so a serum test can determine the horse's vitamin E status. In general, natural sources of vitamin E as well as liquid sources typically have higher bioavailability than our synthetic tocopherols. And that's what you may see. So there's a variety of tocopherols. That's actually what we're talking about when we're talking about vitamin E. And so the source may be fairly important. What I really want to make sure owners know, you wouldn't really want to start a supplemental vitamin E program without some good rationale behind it, and staying within the normal limits, because one of the things that we can do to our animals when we over supplement a nutrient, the body adjusts to the amount that it's seeing, and so you might actually change some metabolic processes or some transport and absorption that sort of expects that higher level coming into the diet, and then if we cease that, you may actually get sort of a crash downwards of the horse's vitamin E status, and that may be true for some other nutrients. So never really recommend just randomly supplementing horses off of a theory. Make sure they actually do need it. So for example, if we're actually talking about disease states in horses where vitamin E status is causing a muscle disorder, the supplemental rate for those horses is tenfold of that of a normal horse. So typically when we're talking about supplementing vitamin E, even for performance horses, we're talking about somewhere between 500 and 1,000 IUs per day, or international units, versus again going up tenfold for a horse that's in a disease state. So we wouldn't want to be doing that without advisement. So again, take care. Don't just randomly supplement vitamin E if you're suspecting a nutritional disorder or a muscle disorder. So certainly trauma can cause muscle disorders in horses. So I always say, any extra blow or tweak or injury can result in muscle damage to the horse. We can cause muscle damage just by overusing the horse, making the muscle sore. So always thinking about that weekend warrior, you know, is the horse fit enough for the job that you're asking them to do? Because forced exercise past their fitness level, just like if you did it, you're going to experience muscle soreness, and that can create a lot of behavioral issues. And again, the horse's performance would suffer from that. And also consider that horse might actually have an undiagnosed lameness. And so the compensation of the other limbs can also create some muscle issues and muscle soreness. So whenever you suspect a muscle disorder in a horse, I think it's worthwhile to actually have a good diagnostic workup of the horse and really try to pinpoint what may be going on, rather than just, you know, trying some management strategies for it. So we do need to get to the root of the problem. So exertional myopathies, these are again our more systemic versions of muscle disorders rather than our localized trauma or like nerve damage that I was talking about before. So there's actually a number of different exertional myopathies in a horse, and we're going to try to go through the most common ones tonight. So a lot of times people think of a horse tying up, and if you've ever witnessed a horse having a pretty severe tying up bout, you're not really going to miss it. So it's pretty obvious the horse is extremely uncomfortable. They may be profusely sweating when it doesn't match the workload at all, stiff and uncomfortable. Their muscles may really feel even hard to the touch, especially through the hindquarter and through the back. You may actually see muscle twitching or muscle fasciculations. Some horses will also experience some head nodding. So that's pretty commonplace in those horses as well. So again, it's pretty unmistakable. If you had a horse that ties up severely, you're going to recognize that, and that's not going to go unnoticed. Some other things that you may see, horses will shorten their stride. Again, they're just going to be really uncomfortable in their hindquarters and their back. However, we may be missing the ones that are not so obvious. So there's the big bouts, sweating and the cramping from a horse that's having those obvious tying up bouts. But horses can have muscle disorders with a little bit more subclinical signs. And so it's important to investigate these in your horse and not just say, oh, it's behavior, or oh, they're just not really wanting to do what they're supposed to. So this may come up as the horse isn't just performing like it used to be. The effort in the horse isn't really there anymore. They're just not quite at the same level that they used to be. You may see, again, a shortened stride behind, and this would be a little bit differently than I was talking about with the first horse, but essentially the horse just not striding up behind. And again, we don't want to discount that because that can be a real issue with these horses, and it's caused by muscle soreness. Horses that struggle through transitions, so aren't able to essentially coil up that energy. And when we talk about good transitions, it's usually with a fair degree of collection. Well, collection is always about the back and the hindquarter, and so if that horse is uncomfortable or sore, those transitions are going to suffer. Again, because of the collection piece and those big muscles, they may report, or the owner may report, the horse is hard to collect, or even that they always tend to have a stiff back, or their back is sort of humped up or hard when you first get on them. So recognize that's not just something you would say, oh, that's just the horse, right? So there can actually be real reasons for that and real disease disorders that are causing that. So often a lot of what we ascribe to behavior problems in a horse may actually come back to pain and these subclinical or not recognized disease states. So definitely think about that. So we're going to go over some tying up things, and then I kind of facetiously, put this into the things that are your fault, and then we'll talk about the genetic disorders. So a lot of it may just be the riders have been a little too enthusiastic with exercising their horses. So I'm not saying that that polo is bad for horses at all, but just paying attention to the level of exertion these horses are under and making sure they're taken care of. Tying up and that overexertion happens a lot with endurance horses, so lots of horses that have been overexerted. Heat exhaustion is a big part of that, so really paying attention to the temperature, allowing horses to cool off, maintain hydration, electrolyte status will keep you out of the tying up that is truly overheat and electrolyte imbalance. So in hot conditions with exercise, we really need to make sure the horse has enough electrolytes in the diet, as well as, again, thinking about the diet, having adequate vitamin E and selenium to help protect the muscles, those important antioxidants. And there's a little bit of thought here too that, and we're going to do this much more in depth as we go, that having these high grain diets where the horse is having a lot of starch coming into them and not enough forage can sort of exacerbate these problems. So, and that will be a theme as we go and we talk about muscle disorders. All right, so here's the genetic ones. And so a lot of kind of scary looking words, and I'm going to use some of their abbreviations as we go forward. But these all essentially have a genetic origin. And these can include really obvious bouts of tying up, and again, these sort of, something's not right. So even though these are genetic disorders, the symptoms can range quite a bit between horse and another horse. So the ones we're going to talk about tonight are RER, which is recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis, polysaccharide storage myopathy, both type 1 and type 2, malignant hyperthermia, and myofibrallar myopathies. So those are going to be our genetic ones we're going to talk about. So we're going to start first with recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis, and that I'm going to abbreviate as RER as we go forward. So the important thing, if you're trying to decide, which version might it be, is actually paying attention to the breed type. So if you look at these horses that I have up here with my pictures, what do they all have in common? These are all speed horses. So thoroughbreds, quarter horses that are bred for speed, racehorse bloodline, standardbreds, are all going to be falling into this RER category. Standardbreds, you may actually see the onset of an RER bout be a little bit more delayed than what you would see in your thoroughbreds and quarter horses. Also remember, standardbreds are trained a little bit differently. They're warmed up differently than thoroughbreds, and standardbreds actually work them at a pretty good clip before these animals actually race. But the irony is that you actually may see this disorder a little bit more in the horses that are truly a little bit more talented or have a little bit more speed. So kind of interesting there. The other horses, the quarter horses and thoroughbreds, you often will see bouts of RER when the horses run under wraps. So what does that mean, to run a horse under wraps? That's when they're actually restrained from going as fast as they want to go. So almost think about that animal is getting really, really excited, really, really hot, so to speak. So think the idea of really having a lot of excitement that sort of surpasses the exertional load. The other ones of these that are more likely to get this are fillies with an excitable temperament. So they always talk about nervous fillies. So those fillies that are really a little hotter, a little twitchier, so to speak, just react more to their environment. So again, you can kind of think about this as it's a lot of epinephrine, or that excitement level of that animal may contribute to a bout of RER. The other commonality that we'll see that this links with some of our other muscle disorders is it follows a period of time that the horse had time off. So where they were not receiving the same amount of exercise and then put back into activity. And so that doesn't mean like after a long layoff, but let's say the animal has been stalled for 2 days or a week, something happened, and then they're worked again. So that may set off that bout of tying up that would be with RER. So RER, actually we'll get into the science here a little bit and try not to get too in depth. It's a disorder with calcium channel regulation, and so don't mistake this as a link with the amount of calcium in the diet. So this is literally down within the muscle cell, where essentially they'll get too much calcium released for the level of synaptic activity that we actually need. In general, of our racehorse kind of population, between those different breeds, about 5 to 7% of the horses would be affected. Typically diagnosed through working up history, as well as doing some blood tests after work to see if there's elevated creatine kinase levels. But what's important to know here, even though I am saying that this is a genetic disorder, and it is, there's not a genetic test for it. So that means they do not have the gene identified that would allow you to test this individual to say, yes, this is what he has. So it would be more of the history, the blood work, etc., rather than a single genetic test. What's different about RER horses, because this is a problem within calcium channel regulation, they're not going to do a muscle biopsy typically with these guys because it's not down at the level that you would visualize it. And we'll talk as we go forward, some disorders where muscle biopsies are actually part of the diagnostic tools. So for my stock horse people, you might be more familiar with PSSM. And we're going to start with polysaccharide storage myopathy type 1. So this is the one that we've known about a little bit longer. If you really like biochemistry, kind of the cool thing about this is these horses have a mutation in their glycogen synthase 1 gene. And so what happens to them is they store too much muscle glycogen in the cell. And while we always talk about how do we get more glycogen in the horse and stored in the muscle for exercise, the problem with this glycogen is it's not really accessible for exercise. So it's glycogen that's stored, but not really very helpful. And the fun thing, I guess I always think about it as kind of fun, I always equate these guys as glucose sponges. So when they have carbohydrate in the diet and they get elevations of blood glucose, they're actually much more efficient at pulling that glucose out of their blood and putting it away into their muscle cells than horses that don't have this. So it's almost, I would say they're like the opposite of being an insulin resistant horse. So instead of leaving the glucose hanging around in the blood, they just soak it all up as soon as they have access to it. And so that will be part of the nutritional strategies we'll talk about as we go. So who are our horses that have PSSM1? Primarily draft horses. Just draft horses are a lower percentage of the population. So you may, if you remember, like the whole idea of Monday morning sickness or azoturia, where the draft horses would be fed fairly amount because they're working, right? And then they have the weekend off and they go back to work on Monday. That's where the Monday morning sickness would come up. So that is still prevalent in draft horses. Again, we just don't have as many draft horses as we used to. You do see it a lot in our stock breeds. So rather than our race horses, think about our little quieter type of horses here. So quarter horses, paints, Appaloosas. The prevalence is expected to be as high as 28% in halter bred horses of these stock type horses. And again, you don't see it in the hotter race bred horses. So a little bit more of the calmer, a little bit more mild mannered kind of horses. We do see some of it in warm bloods as well. So that disorder does happen in them. So you'll see a lot of that kind of hind limb problems with those guys with it. And we don't really see it, again, in our horses that have been bred for racing. So don't really see it in standardbreds, thoroughbreds, or Arabians, although they get some other disorders. So again, primarily a draft horse and stock horse type of disorder. So just kind of thinking about that, in Oklahoma, we're primarily a stock horse state. So there's supposed to be about 250,000 horses in Oklahoma. Again, most of them are going to be of the stock horse type. So if we're even kind of thinking about this conservatively, that may mean we almost have 15,000 horses with PSSM1 in Oklahoma. So hopefully you guys don't own one. I have had one before, and it's not as much fun as you think. So some other things about PSSM1. When you're going to see these bouts of tying up with them, Essentially, you're going to see it fairly early into an exercise regimen with them. Typically when it's still light exercise. So kind of when you're just getting started, that horse may actually start to tie up. Again, you'll see that profuse sweating, the muscle cramping, and it really is going to be so far removed from the intensity of the exercise. So that's kind of the hallmark of this disorder. Typically accompanies rest the day before. So just like our RER horses, rest in these muscle disorder horses can trigger an episode of tying up. They're going to be on the wrong diet. And again, we'll talk about that more as we go. And so we can see either the blatant tying up where it's really, really obvious, or again, these horses that do it a little bit more mildly, where they're just don't act right, they don't really want to go forward, maybe they're more ear painting today, or they're just really rough in their transitions, choppy in their stride, any of those things that, again, think those big muscles in the hindquarter in the back being affected. This is going to be an unhappy animal, and again, it's from pain that's going on here. So on the good news, if you think that all sounds like fun, there actually is a genetic test because, again, they know the gene that is affected, glycogen synthase 1, and so you can have a suspected horse just tested, and then you will know whether or not they actually have this disorder and whether management will help with them. Now, PSSM2 is a little different, but a little the same. So these horses also have abnormal glycogen, but it isn't because of the glycogen synthase gene. So it's not going to stain as intensely as those horses that I just showed you before, the muscle biopsies. And here's the unfortunate reality. So they don't know what exactly is causing it, meaning they don't have, this is the gene that's going wrong, or this is the pathway that is upregulated. So when I mean there's no genetic link, there's still genetic commonalities, right? But we don't have the, hey, it's this line, or hey, it is this gene that we can look for. So we know it's something, the researchers that are in this area, but we don't have it sort of pinned down quite yet. So here's some muscle biopsies. So the top horses are type 1 and the bottom horses are type 2. So you can see the difference in the intensity and staining between the type 1 horses and the type 2. So if you suspect your horse has PSSM type 2, the only true diagnostic tool at this point in time is a muscle biopsy. There is not currently a validated genetic test. And again, I'm going to say that it has not been validated. There are some tests out there, but I'm just going to put that into that statement, but they have not been validated. The trickier thing with the type 2 horses, it's typically not going to cause as strong of symptoms as our type 1 horses. So it can be a little milder, so it can be a little bit harder to diagnose. And some of the downsides of these diagnostic tests with them, those muscle biopsies have to be handled pretty carefully because we can alter results with poor handling, wrong temperature, and you can also get some false positives in there as well. So it's a tricky one. Again, we're kind of early into the understanding completely over what's happening with the PSSM type 2 horses. So PSSM type 2, who is it? Well, it is more common in cutters, reiners, barrel horses, pleasure horses, and halter horses. And so in my world, well, that's pretty much everybody, right? So who is it not? It's not the race horses. So that's great to know. Okay, it's pretty likely that quarter horses can have that. Again, at the moment, there is no validated genetic test. And if you're really interested in some of that, Michigan State University, Dr. Stephanie Valberg is the leading researcher in muscle disorders in horses. And they actually have some really good resources available if you want to read through how or why those genetic tests may not really be accurate. So again, that's at Michigan State and it's Dr. Ballberg's lab. Okay, so let's switch to a different one. We're going to get off the stock horses a little bit. So Myofibrallar Myopathy, or MFM. So this is seen in essentially warm bloods and Arabians. In the warm bloods, you're going to see it not when they're young. It's sort of going to start to creep up on you somewhere when they're almost in their prime, unfortunately. So kind of the ages between 6 and 10 or so. And you may see, again, it's sort of this poor performance. Horse isn't acting like he used to be, and a little bit more unwilling. So all the same things, rougher transitions, maybe short in stride. We're just not having the same animal anymore. Arabians are the other group that are going to have this more so. It's seen of our Arabians in the endurance horses, so the horses that are bred for that, and do that a little bit more. And here we have another commonality with, it seems to happen more when horses have had time off. So it's sounding like you can never go on vacation and we have to ride all these horses all the time to keep them healthy. So yay, horse ownership. So again, more in warm bloods and Arabians. So what is this one? And I'm not going to try to get way down into the weeds here on the science piece. But essentially these guys get like little breaks or tears. So again, I don't want to get into all of the technology or physiology of how muscle cells work. But essentially there's a protein called desmin that helps keep the myofibrils lined up. And so they have these little like Z lines where the muscle fibers join, and that's where the ends contract and make them shorter. That may be going too far already. So essentially with a stain or on a muscle biopsy, the glycogen actually can sort of look like the type 2 horses because the glycogen sort of deposits in the gaps or the breaks in these muscle cells. So if you look over here to the right, you can almost see where things are lining up. And so that's where the space in those breaks essentially is going to allow glycogen to deposit there. The picture on the left actually is the desmin lighting up. So this is a horse with these abnormal desmin deposits, and this would be what a normal horse looks like. So kind of some fun physiology, again, not for owners that may have it, but a unique pathology within Arabians and warm bloods. And then the other genetic disorder is malignant hyperthermia. So this one is primarily going to be seen in our stock horses, again, quarter horses and paints. I think this one actually is tied to 2 lines of horses, and we won't say which ones those are. But what do you see with these guys? So the hyperthermia, when they're having bouts with this, essentially a lot of muscle rigidity, their body temperature is going to be too elevated, excessive sweating, they may have really high heart rates, even abnormal heart rhythms, and this can actually be pretty severe for these guys, and death can result. And unfortunately, this is one that can go with PSSM1. So some horses win the unlucky genetic pool and have both. So they have a disorder in glycogen synthase as well as malignant hyperthermia. And in these horses, that their bouts of tying up are much more intense than in other horses. And I've actually had the joy of owning one of these guys. It can be really hard to manage, quite painful for the horse. So if we want to upside to this, there is at least a genetic test for malignant hyperthermia. Owners have to be careful when veterinarians are anesthetizing these horses. They have to be just selective in the drug agents that they use. And honestly, you're going to manage them quite similarly to how you would manage a PSSM1 type horse. So let's talk about management, because that's, again, probably what everybody wants to know about. So again, I've actually had quite a bit of experience riding horses with different disorders and know what it feels like to have one. All right, so recommendations. What are we going to do? So diet. So we want to pay attention to the diet of the horse for all of these different disorders. In general, and I'd honestly say this for any horse, we want to make sure that forage is maximized. So we're going to try to keep forage intake high at 1.5 to 2% of their body weight. What's going to be key for these guys is knowing what's in your forage, because forage should be the bulk of what your horse is eating. And because these guys have issues with non-structural carbohydrates and blood glucose and glycogen, we want to keep that value lower than 12%. So it's really important that your hay is tested so you know that you're feeding forage that's appropriate for these kind of horses. If your horses are on pasture, we have any issues with that, we really want to lower intake with them. So dry lots for one, so they don't get to eat pasture, or the use of grazing muzzles to really restrict how much they're eating. If you just use partial turnout, trust me, horses learn like, oh, I only get 3 hours to eat, and they'll just eat as fast as they can. And so the grazing muzzles are probably a better idea for these guys. When you're selecting concentrates for them, you want to make sure that you're low in sugars and starches. And so making sure that you're looking for feeds that have that on the label so that you know that your feed is going to be safe for those horses. So avoiding feeds that are going to be high in traditional cereal grains, we want to steer clear from those and get a lower NSC value. We also want to shift the metabolism of these guys. And essentially the idea here of burning fat or feeding them fat isn't just to provide calories to them, but that's part of it. If you're going to have a heavily performing horse and drop them off of a lot of sugar and starch, we got to get calories back in. But also when the animal is adapted to a fat-added diet, we change essentially the enzymes and the metabolic pathways, and we get their energy systems geared more towards fatty acid oxidation rather than glucose metabolism. And so that's pretty key in these guys too. So fat, a couple other reasons fat might actually be a good choice for them. On our nervous twitchy horses, where that excitability was a contributing factor, fat does seem to have a calming effect on horses, so a little bit less reactivity with them. Again, as I said before, we're shifting their metabolism away from carbohydrates and getting it more based towards fatty acid oxidation. So depending on the horse, so with RER horses, and again, those are race horses, so we're talking about heavily exercising horses anyhow, we want to make sure that they're able to get enough calories, because that's typically one of the limiting factors in these intensely exercised horses, is getting enough energy to them. You have to be careful if you're feeding these super efficient PSSM horses and you're using a really high fat diet, they can get fat. So we have to make sure we control intake on that. Because again, they're pretty metabolically efficient most of the time. So make sure you're monitoring body condition on them. For the type 2, we're gonna really follow very, very similar guidelines for them as we do for the type 1 horses. And so there's been some positive results in managing their diet more appropriately. Right now, the diet management strategy seems to work better for the stock horses than it does for the other breeds that might have type 2. So that might mean there may be something else going on there. But again, it's kind of early on the process of knowing completely what's happening with these horses. Protein has certainly been recommended for horses that have the Myofibrallar Myopathies. That they may respond to so some supplemental amino acids in horses that may be having top line issues or atrophy issues from underlying causes. The link with the whey seems to be something with cysteine metabolism. So again, I think we're still pretty early on that path of understanding. And just as a side note, if you have a horse that you also suspect is a metabolic syndrome horse, and you would be losing all the lotteries at that point in time, just be careful with giving them a lot of protein. So there's a little bit of information out there that says maybe we need to pump the brakes on protein supplementation on the metabolic horses. And we'll talk about metabolic horses some other time. And then honestly, management is going to be a key part of these guys maintaining quality of life and health and living a pain-free, normal life. So they shouldn't get rest. So what does that mean? You ride your horse every day? No, that's not exactly what I mean. But stall confinement on their rest days is not going to be good. So we still want these guys getting turned out. Ideally, that turnout is not just a boring dry lot where they stand there and wait to get back in, but having more room to move or having other horses with them that would encourage activity. So we don't want just standing still in a larger area. So we want to make sure that the horse is still getting some exercise. So again, stall confinement is going to be really, really hard in these horses. So we need to avoid that. For our RER horses, so as much as possible, avoiding excitement, that may be hard. But kind of understanding your horse and what causes stress in them, maybe really spending some time training to get that horse in a calmer, more relaxed state, or finding, you know, what are these horses' triggers and avoiding those scenarios. So that's going to be key of knowing that individual horse. Really important that we stick to those diets and we avoid the non-structural carbohydrates. We don't just say, oh, they should, you know, it's a nice day, maybe they should get to eat the grass. So diet management as well as exercise is going to be pretty key for these guys. So with all of that, we can get a better quality of life for them. We may never get them to the full performance level that maybe you were expecting. Or maybe they were at before. Certainly enough bouts of tying up can create some muscle damage in these horses, or they learn to associate some of these activities with pain, and so you may have some mental memories that are hard to overcome. So just thinking about that. So again, it's sort of realistic expectations of what that horse may be able to do.